Biden faces physical risks in flying to war-torn Middle East. President heads into area subject to rocket and bomb attacks, though experts say he will be heavily protected. President Biden arrived in Israel on Wednesday, flying into an active war zone where hostilities are high and the course and breadth of the war between Israel and Hamas remain extraordinarily unpredictable. Israel and Hamas have exchanged fierce rocket fire and aerial strikes since Palestinian gunmen from Hamas stormed through the Israel-Gaza border on October 7 and launched the deadliest attack in Israel's history, killing more than 1,400 Israelis. Israel has launched an aerial counterattack that has killed roughly 3,000 people in Gaza and incited outrage across the Middle East. Adding to the risks of Biden's trip was a deadly explosion at a Gaza hospital on Tuesday that killed at least 500 people, according to the Palestinian Health Ministry. Palestinian officials say an Israeli airstrike hit the hospital courtyard where displaced Gazans were taking shelter, while the Israel Defense Forces blamed an errant rocket from the Palestinian Islamic Jihad militant group, saying a barrage of rockets was passing near the hospital when it was hit. The hospital blast has set off fierce protests in the Middle East, including in Jordan, where the Israeli embassy was surrounded by protesters Tuesday evening. A planned visit by Biden to Amman on Wednesday was cancelled after the strike, forcing the U.S. president to forego a scheduled meeting with Jordanian King Abdullah II, Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, and Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas. A White House official said Biden looks forward to consulting in person with these leaders soon, and agreed to remain regularly and directly engaged with each of them over the coming days. Some security experts said the physical risk to Biden would be relatively small despite the chaos in the region. Biden is one of the most protected people on the planet, they said, and Air Force One is equipped with sophisticated air defense systems that can thwart incoming rockets and missiles. Perhaps the safest plane on planet Earth is Air Force One, said Bilal Saab, senior fellow and director of the Middle East Institute's Defense and Security Program. Air Force One is perfectly capable of handling any kind of missile launch or rocket launch inside Gaza. Still, it's a rarity for a president to travel directly into a region where hostilities are intensifying, with an Israeli ground incursion into Gaza expected within days and fears that the militant group Hezbollah might enter the fray. Biden faces at least some risk when he is on the ground in Tel Aviv, a city Hamas rockets are able to reach. In Amman, which Biden had planned to visit after his stop in Tel Aviv, the situation remains combustible. Being in an active area of hostilities, they have to look very carefully at the threats that Israel is facing now, understanding that the president will be on the ground, said Jonathan Lord, senior fellow and director of the Middle East Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. So they're definitely thinking about Israel's air defense capabilities and protecting the president from Hamas rockets. He added, by and large, they're thinking about the same threats that Israelis are now facing on a day-to-day basis. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin have both been to Israel since the Hamas attack, providing more assurance that Biden can travel there safely, experts said. A meeting between Blinken and Israel's war cabinet this week was interrupted by air sirens warning of incoming rocket fire, sending the top U.S. diplomat and Israeli military officials rushing into a nearby shelter. The dramatic moment underscored the risks that persist with high-level U.S. visits to Israel. The crisis erupted on October 7, when Hamas militants broke through Israel's sophisticated border fence with Gaza and hunted Israeli civilians in their cars and homes, shot people indiscriminately and took scores of hostages into Gaza, including some Americans. Tensions have only grown since then as the brutality and scope of Hamas's attacks have become clearer and as Israel has launched repeated deadly airstrikes in Gaza. Biden's visit comes as Israel is expected to launch a ground invasion that it says is an effort to destroy Hamas, potentially setting off one of the worst conflicts in the region in decades. U.S. officials are deeply concerned that the war could spread and draw in such actors as Hezbollah or Iran. Biden has stressed his ironclad support for Israel since the Hamas attacks, but in recent days, he has sought to strike a more delicate balance between support for Israel's right to self-defense and concern about civilians in Gaza, where conditions have rapidly deteriorated. Gaza is a densely populated enclave of more than 2 million people, about half of whom are children. Even without a formal occupation, Israel controls almost all aspects of life in the territory. Israel announced a full siege of Gaza in response to the Hamas attacks, cutting off food, water, electricity, and fuel, tactics that human rights groups have said violate international law. The country has also unleashed an unrelenting bombardment campaign and warned more than 1 million Palestinians to flee northern Gaza to avoid being in harm's way, an order that the United Nations called impossible. Biden and his top aides have said they are working to secure humanitarian corridors so that Palestinian civilians can flee and aid can get into the Palestinian territory. Despite the combustible conditions, the United States has the benefit of Israeli intelligence and air defense capabilities in helping to protect Biden, experts said. Still, that intelligence conspicuously fell short in detecting the Hamas attacks. Experts said Biden's trip to Kyiv this year was in some ways more dangerous than the Israel trip because Russia has a far more sophisticated military than Hamas. Although Hamas is arguably a far more unpredictable entity, its militants are unlikely to have the technology or prowess to launch a targeted attack against an American president. In terms of threats and risks, Hamas and their capabilities pale in comparison to the Russian military, Lord said. For the Kyiv trip, White House officials did not disclose Biden's whereabouts until he had safely entered the city. In contrast, the president's trip to Tel Aviv was publicly announced by Blinken on Monday. Biden is not the first U.S. president to visit an active war zone, although generally such visits take place in areas where American troops are engaged in active fighting. President Barack Obama visited Iraq and Afghanistan, and President George W. Bush also visited both war zones multiple times. President Bill Clinton visited Gaza City during his presidency, a trip that alarmed the Secret Service at the time but occurred without incident, said Bruce Riedel, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution who served in the Clinton administration. Riedel said the bigger risk in coming days could be faced by members of Biden's entourage and White House staffers who are not as protected as the president. The risk to the president himself is probably pretty minimal. He is surrounded by Secret Service, and the Israelis will provide additional protection layers, Riedel said. He added that Biden flying in and out of the Middle East in one day, rather than staying in an easily identifiable location overnight, further minimizes the risks. White House officials said they have not sought assurances that Israel will not launch its ground invasion while Biden is visiting the country, despite their deep concern that the Israel-Gaza war could escalate into a broader regional conflict. Biden has warned other actors, particularly Iran, not to jump into the fighting. But U.S. officials say they recognize that anger among Arab citizens over the humanitarian crisis and Israel's military strikes in Gaza could boil over and create pressure for their leaders to take action against Israel. White House officials have been working to assure Arab partners that they are trying to get aid into Gaza and minimize civilian casualties. In recent days, Biden has made a point of stressing the distinction between Hamas and ordinary Palestinians. I think we have seen a significant shift in the administration's position, Riedel said. On October 7, it was, "We're 100% behind Israel. We have Israel's back. We're still behind Israel, we still have Israel's back, but we're also eager to avoid significant civilian casualties in Gaza and we do not want the conflict to spread to other areas." Biden, in Israel, hits notes of loyalty, emotion, and caution. In an extraordinary moment, an 80-year-old president flies into a war zone. In an emotional speech carried live across Israel and around the world, President Biden sought to embody America's ties to the Jewish state with his own presence, channeling empathy, anger, profound loss, and bracing optimism. He reached deep into history, recounting the timelessness of Moses and lessons from the Torah, and he referenced more recent events, noting how the September 11, 2001, attacks triggered shock, pain, rage, and all-consuming rage among Americans. It was an extraordinary moment in Biden's tenure, as the 80-year-old president landed in the midst of a region torn by violence and chaos in an effort to showcase America's loyalties, warn hostile actors and, perhaps, underline his own fitness as commander-in-chief. He even reached into his own lengthy biography. 50 years ago, the young Senator Biden was meeting with Golda Meir, the Israeli Prime Minister, and they were posing for pictures after she had shown him maps intended to demonstrate Israel's vulnerability on the precipice of the Yom Kippur War. She said to me, "Why do you look so worried, Senator Biden?" Biden recalled in a story he's repeated often. And I said, "Worried? Like, of course I'm worried. And she looked at me, she said, "We don't worry, Senator. We Israelis have a secret weapon, we have nowhere else to go." Biden turned back to the present. "Today, I say to all of Israel, the United States isn't going anywhere either. We're going to stand with you. We'll walk beside you in those dark days. We'll walk beside you in the good days to come, and they will come." It was a remarkable moment at a remarkable time. Biden is the first American president to visit Israel at time of war. There were unusual security challenges, with reporters asked not to disclose real-time locations and with air raid sirens blaring over Tel Aviv minutes after Biden's plane departed Wednesday evening. He was originally supposed to fly to Jordan and meet with Arab leaders, but that leg of the trip was cancelled after a blast rocked the Al-Ali hospital in Gaza, prompting angry protests in the Arab world. Biden's aides saw the trip in part as a rebuttal to questions about his age. He was born about 6 years before the country of Israel and recounts events from 5 decades ago, and as a way to showcase the strengths of a president who prides himself on his foreign policy know-how. The president's trip also provided a split screen that Biden's supporters hope plays in his favor. On Wednesday, House Republicans again devolved into chaos after failing to elect a House Speaker, and Biden's leading 2024 opponent, Donald Trump, was in a trial over fraud allegations. Biden, after an overnight 10-hour flight, was in the country for less than 8 hours before a long flight back to Washington. The whirlwind visit had some of the hallmarks of his surprise trip to Kyiv earlier this year, when he sneaked into the war-torn country in the middle of the night and was in the city when an air raid siren went off. It was also reminiscent of his trip last month to India and Vietnam, when he circumnavigated the globe in 4 days. Such trips can test the stamina of aides and reporters half his age, and Biden, too, sometimes appears to feel the impact. On Wednesday, his memory seemed to lapse as he recalled one of his most frequently cited quotes, which he attributes to Secretary of State Antony Blinken. "He wrote a line that I think is appropriate," Biden said. He said, "It's not, we lead not just, well, I won't go into it. I'll wait until later. I'm taking too much time." Shortly after, he found the phrase, "It's just not the example of our power, it's the power of our example." The Israel trip allowed Biden to showcase the power of the American presidency in dramatic fashion. He announced, for example, that his military had ordered 2 aircraft carriers, the USS Gerald R. Ford and USS Dwight D. Eisenhower, into the region. He sought to speak with authority. "I've made wartime decisions. I know the choices are never clear or easy for the leadership," he said. "There's always costs. But I caution this, while you feel that rage, don't be consumed by it." Other portions of the trip were quintessential Biden. He quoted an Irish poet, William Butler Yeats. He referenced a Hebrew saying, though not in the original, "I'm not going to attempt to do it, because I'm such a terrible linguist." He spoke of the difficulty of losing a loved one, as he often does, but with added context for a Jewish audience. "I know you feel like there's that black hole in the middle of your chest. You feel like you're being sucked into it," Biden said. "The survivor's remorse, the anger, the questions of faith in your soul. Staring at that empty chair, sitting Shiva. The first Sabbath without them." He met Israeli first responders and families affected by the Hamas attack, something that Netanyahu has faced criticism for being slow to do. "God love ya," he told one survivor. He also met a young woman who had saved people in her kibbutz and hugged her after hearing her story through an interpreter. At one point, Biden could be heard recounting the story of when his wife and children were injured in a car accident. He whispered throughout. He met with Inbal Lieberman, a 25-year-old woman who, as head of security, helped to organize the successful defense of her kibbutz. He met a retired general, Noam Taiban, who drove south to save his son, Amir, and many others in their community. Netanyahu effusively welcomed Biden, greeting him at the airport and embracing him on the tarmac. "I want to thank you for coming here today and for the unequivocal support you've given Israel over these trying times," said Netanyahu, whose relations with Biden have not always been friendly. "We see your support and your steadfast commitment to provide us with the tools we need to defend ourselves." Biden sought to use his presence, and America's prestige, to urge Israel to minimize civilian casualties. During a refueling stop at Ramstein Air Base in Germany, He made a rare trip back to the press cabin and told reporters that he had made progress on a 30-minute call with Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi. Egypt, he said, was going to help facilitate sending 20 trucks with humanitarian aid into Gaza. Biden cast the news as a capstone to the trip, recounting that there had been a lengthy debate about whether he should make the visit in the first place, with fears of potential failure. "Not many people thought we could get this done. And not many people want to be associated with failure," he said. "Had we gone and this failed, then, the United States failed, the Biden presidency fails, etc. Which would be a legitimate criticism. I thought it was worth taking the chance to get it done," he said. "I came to get something done. I got it done." Tyler Pager contributed to this report. Biden, in Tel Aviv, backs Israel's claim of innocence on hospital blast. President's trip is a dramatic display of support for Israel as fighting continues to rage in the region. Tel Aviv, President Biden on Wednesday firmly backed Israel's position that it was not responsible for the recent blast at a Gaza hospital site that killed numerous people, making his comments during a risky trip here while the region is still engulfed in turmoil. "Based on the information we've seen today, it appears as a result of an errant rocket fired by a terrorist group in Gaza," Biden said after meeting with victims of the October 7 Hamas attack in Israel and relatives of those being held hostage by the militant group. "The United States unequivocally stands for the protection of civilian life during the conflict. And I grieve. I truly grieve for the families who were killed or wounded by this tragedy," Biden said. Earlier in the day, the president said his assessment of responsibility was based on data shown to him by the U.S. Defense Department. Adrienne Watson, a spokeswoman for the National Security Council, said in a statement Wednesday evening that the U.S. government assessment was based on available reporting, including intelligence, missile activity, overhead imagery, and open-source video and images of the incident. "The intelligence," she said, "indicates that some Palestinian militants in the Gaza Strip believed the explosion was caused by a rocket or missile launched by a militant group, Palestinian Islamic Jihad." She said U.S. officials are working to corroborate whether that is the case. Biden's assessment was based on multiple pieces of information, including intelligence provided by the Israelis, according to officials familiar with the process who spoke on the condition of anonymity to discuss sensitive security matters. The president may address the hospital blast again Thursday evening. The White House announced that Biden will deliver an Oval Office address at 8 p.m. Thursday on Russia's war against Ukraine as well as the Hamas attacks in Israel. White House officials are considering asking Congress for an aid package for Israel and Ukraine that could cost as much as $100 billion, although the exact amount is still in flux. Assistance for Israel is broadly popular in Congress, but some Republicans have shown resistance to providing further aid to Ukraine. The blast at the Gaza hospital derailed Biden's trip even before he left Washington. Since the hospital was devastated Tuesday by a strike that Palestinian authorities said killed hundreds of people, Israel and the United States have been the targets of rage, condemnation and protest that have surged across the Middle East. Wednesday's statements by Israel and the United States that a Palestinian militant group was responsible for the blast may carry little weight with Arab protesters. Later Wednesday, Biden told reporters he understands why some in the region are skeptical of the assessment. "I don't say things like that unless I have faith in the source I've got," he said. "Our Defense Department says it's highly unlikely it's the Israelis." Biden had planned to travel to Jordan to meet with Arab leaders Wednesday after visiting Israel, but as Air Force One started rolling down the tarmac at Joint Base Andrews outside Washington the previous night, White House officials alerted reporters that the Jordan visit was being scrapped amid the angry reaction in the Arab world to the hospital blast. Among the most useful pieces of information in identifying who may be responsible for a strike are infrared signatures from satellites, which may have detected a rocket launch as opposed to an aerial bombing, one U.S. official said. Images of the impact site, as well as any fragments recovered, could also help identify who was responsible, the official said. The Pentagon on Wednesday declined to release any information detailing how it came to its assessment. Despite Biden's statements Wednesday, senior officials at the UN Security Council on Wednesday called for an independent investigation, without acknowledging U.S.-backed Israeli conclusions that the strike was caused by an errant rocket fired by militants inside Gaza. Representatives from Russia and China at the Security Council referred to the blast as an airstrike, with Russia calling for a stop to indiscriminate attacks on the Gaza Strip, including an airstrike on a hospital. The U.S. conclusion appeared to do little to assuage anger in Arab and Muslim countries, where people generally harbor deep distrust of Israel and the United States. Israel's army in the past has blamed Palestinian militants for strikes and civilian deaths, and then later acknowledged it was probably at fault, such as in the death of Al Jazeera journalist Shireen Abu Akleh. Such skepticism could make it harder for Arab leaders to accept Biden's conclusion, and harder to help him prevent the Israel-Gaza conflict from widening into a regional conflagration. Since the hospital blast, protesters have taken to the streets from Morocco to Iran, often in marches held in front of Israeli or Western diplomatic missions, and sometimes including the burning of the Israeli flag. Several governments, including those of Saudi Arabia and Turkey, directly condemned Israel after the strike. U.S. Central Command, which oversees American military personnel in the Middle East, said its forces had shot down 3 drones in Iraq over the past day, with minor injuries to one coalition member. Military officials said that in this moment of heightened alert, they are vigilantly monitoring the situation in Iraq and the region. The protests in part reflected the pent-up anger at the mounting civilian toll in Gaza. For Arab leaders, the popular outrage threatened to halt any movement toward rapprochement with Israel that had been underway. Shortly after landing in Israel, Biden, while meeting with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, said he was deeply saddened and outraged by the event. "Based on what I've seen, it appears as though it was done by the other team, not you," Biden told the Israeli leader, referring to the hospital strike. Biden arrived in an active war zone at a tense and unpredictable moment as Israel prepares for an expected ground incursion into Gaza in response to a brutal surprise attack by Hamas that killed at least 1,400 Israelis. Israel has launched an aerial counterattack that has killed roughly 3,000 people in Gaza. Palestinian and Israeli officials have traded blame for the blast at Al-Ali Hospital, which potentially includes the deadliest single toll on civilians in the Strip since the conflict began. In Amman, Jordan, Biden had been scheduled to meet with the leaders of Jordan, Egypt and the Palestinian Authority to discuss the conflict and the need for humanitarian assistance in Gaza. The White House said Biden would continue to be in touch with those leaders, but the meeting's cancellation was a setback to the president's diplomatic efforts. Administration officials on Wednesday briefed members of Congress about the hospital strike, and they largely appeared convinced by the White House's conclusion that Israel was not responsible. House and Senate Intelligence Committee leaders said after reviewing intelligence that they were confident in the assessment. Senators Mark R. Warner, Democrat, Virginia, and Marco Rubio, Republican, Florida, the top lawmakers on the Senate Intelligence Committee, said in a statement that they believed the explosion was the result of a failed rocket launch by militant terrorists and not the result of an Israeli airstrike, matching Israel's explanation. Warner also told reporters on Wednesday afternoon that he thinks it is important for the administration and frankly the Israelis to release as much evidence as possible to make sure that the origins of this horrific attack on the hospital are made clear. Representative Mike Waltz, Republican, Florida, a member of the House Intelligence Committee, said in an interview that he was very comfortable with the administration's assessment and the rigor behind it. Israel announced a full siege of Gaza, a densely populated enclave of more than 2 million people, in retaliation for the October 7 Hamas attacks, cutting off food, fuel, water and electricity. It also ordered the evacuation of more than 1 million Gaza civilians in 24 hours, a task the United Nations called impossible. Conditions in Gaza, which are already difficult, are rapidly deteriorating and have set off a humanitarian crisis. White House officials have said in recent days they were working to secure a humanitarian corridor and aid into the territory. Biden's trip to Israel marked his second visit to an active war zone this year, after he made a secretive trip to Kyiv in February. Before Biden's visit to Ukraine, no U.S. president had traveled to a war zone in which U.S. troops were not actively involved and could not provide security on the ground. In Israel, rocket sirens throughout the country have been ringing, warning citizens to seek shelter. After Biden landed in the country, at least 2 sirens sounded close to the border with Gaza. Another set of alarms sounded in Tel Aviv and central Israel just minutes after he departed the country Wednesday afternoon. Of course these types of trips have risks, White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre told reporters during the flight to Israel. So we understand that, but also the president understands how important it is to have these diplomatic conversations to get things done. Before his meeting with Israel's war cabinet, Biden condemned Hamas's attack as almost beyond belief and promised sustained U.S. support. I want you to know you're not alone, he said, adding, we will continue to have Israel's back as you work to defend your people. Netanyahu, who has a long but complicated relationship with Biden, heaped praise on the president for making the trip to his country. For the people of Israel, there's only one thing better than having a true friend like you standing with Israel, and that is having you standing in Israel, Netanyahu said. Your visit here is the first visit of an American president in Israel at a time of war, and it is deeply, deeply moving. It speaks to the depth of your personal commitment to Israel. Several English-language billboards in Tel Aviv welcomed Biden upon his arrival. Later, Netanyahu said that Hamas perpetrates a double war crime every day, reiterating accusations by Israeli officials that the militant group targets Israeli citizens while hiding behind Palestinian civilians. Hamas is embedding themselves in the civilian population and using them as human shields, Netanyahu said. This will be a different kind of war because Hamas is a different kind of enemy, he added. While Israel seeks to minimize civilian casualties, Hamas seeks to maximize civilian casualties. Hamas wants to kill as many Israelis as possible and has no regard whatsoever for Palestinian lives. Before Biden arrived in Tel Aviv, John Kirby, a White House spokesman, said the president planned to ask his Israeli counterparts tough questions about their objectives in the coming weeks, during the expected ground incursion into Gaza and beyond. This is not about directing operations for the Israeli Defense Forces, and by tough questions, I don't mean menacing or in any way adversarial, Kirby told reporters aboard Air Force One. Just hard questions a good friend of Israel would ask about sort of where they think they're going, what their plans are going forward. Abutaleb, Lamont and Harris reported from Washington. Karen DeYoung in Washington contributed to this report. U.S. to appeal sentences of 5 Proud Boys in January 6 Capitol riot case. Prison terms were among the longest for January 6 defendants, but far below government recommendations. The government filed notice Monday that it was appealing the sentences of the 5 members of the far-right Proud Boys group convicted in the January 6 attack, the second such unusual notice by federal prosecutors after a similar filing in July indicating they would challenge the punishments handed down to 5 members of the Oath Keepers for their role in the Capitol riot. In both cases, the prosecutors were not required to file any explanation for their initial notices, but both cases could reflect government dissatisfaction with the length of the sentences, even though the Proud Boys' former leader Henry Enrique Tarrio received the longest sentence yet imposed for the January 6 Capitol riot and 3 other members received more than 15 years in prison. A spokeswoman for the U.S. Attorney's Office said the filing merely preserves our ability to appeal, though the government typically does not appeal sentences after they are imposed. The seditious conspiracy convictions of Tarrio and Oath Keepers founder Stuart Rhodes were among the most high-profile prosecutions for the Justice Department's sprawling January 6 investigation that targeted organized far-right groups and more than 1,000 others who attacked the Capitol as Congress met to confirm the 2020 Electoral College results. In both cases, the judges imposed sentences well below those recommended by the federal sentencing guidelines, which are only advisory. The prosecution's practice in most January 6 sentencings has been to calculate the guideline range, which combines a defendant's criminal history and the seriousness of the offense, and then propose a sentence in the middle of that range. The judges then calculate their own guideline range, and can go within, above or below that range. In more than 60% of the January 6 felony cases, the D.C. judges have gone below their own calculated guideline range, and below the prosecution's sentencing recommendations in 80% of all cases, according to a Washington Post database. Sentencing guidelines are not used in most misdemeanor cases. In the Proud Boys case, prosecutors calculated that Tarrio, the leader of the group, should have a sentencing range of 30 years to life, and recommended a term of 33 years. But U.S. District Judge Timothy J. Kelly, a Trump appointee, calculated Tarrio's range at 27 to 34 years in prison, and then gave him a sentence of 22 years. Judges are not required to explain why they deviate from the guidelines, as they were when the guidelines were mandatory. The Supreme Court made the guidelines advisory in 2005. Kelly acted similarly with the other 4 convicted Proud Boys members. Prosecutors sought a term of 33 years for Joseph Biggs, who was on the front lines of the January 6 attack, and Kelly sentenced him to 17 years. Prosecutors sought 27 years for Ethan Nordine, Kelly gave him 18 years. Prosecutors sought terms of 30 years and 20 years for Zachary Rell and Dominic Petzola, Kelly imposed terms of 15 and 10 years, respectively. Nordine's 18-year sentence equaled the term given to Rhodes, the second longest January 6 sentence, after Tarrio. Biggs's and Rell's terms are the next longest of the more than 650 sentences handed down to January 6 defendants so far. We look forward to reviewing whatever the government intends to file as a basis for their appeal, said Naib Hassan, one of Tarrios' lawyers. Hassan added, "We are tediously working on the issues for Tarrios' appeal and believe we will prevail on multiple grounds." Attorney Norman Pattis, who represented Rell and Biggs at their sentencings, said in an email after the notice was filed, "Merrick Garland is unhinged. Period. Call him the Inspector Javert of the DOJ. He should take up bungee jumping. This is no longer my government." Nicholas Smith, Nordine's lawyer, said in an email that his client is encouraged by the government's agreement that errors led to the judgment and sentence in his case. Roger Roots, an attorney for Petzola, called the intended appeal an outrageous abuse of power. "These are already the longest sentences in American history for participating in a political demonstration," Roots said in a statement. Congress was only delayed for 6 hours on January 6. The DOJ is really engaging in overkill. This story has been updated. Supreme Court again leaves Biden administration's ghost gun rules in place. The Supreme Court on Monday once again reinstated the Biden administration's regulations on ghost guns, firearms assembled from kits without the usual serial numbers and background checks on purchasers. The administration's regulations, which apply to self-made weapons the same kind of licensing and record-keeping required of guns sold commercially, will remain in place while legal battles continue. There were no noted dissents in the ensigned order, which was necessary because of contrary rulings from lower courts. In August, the Supreme Court on a 5-4 vote allowed the Biden administration's regulations to stay in effect. But after the order was issued, U.S. District Judge Reed O'Connor of Texas again stepped in to block the regulations as applied to 2 manufacturers who supply a large number of the kits sold nationwide. A panel of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit largely upheld that ruling. The Biden administration told the Supreme Court the lower courts had flouted its August order, and again asked the justices to intervene. The District Court and the Fifth Circuit have effectively countermanded this court's authoritative determination about the status quo that should prevail while legal challenges continue, Solicitor General Elizabeth B. Prelogar said in a filing. She added, "The court should not tolerate that affront to basic principles of judicial review." In the ensigned, 1-paragraph order in August, Chief Justice John G. Roberts Jr. and fellow conservative Justice Amy Coney Barrett joined liberal Justices Sonia Sotomayor, Elena Kagan and Ketanji Brown Jackson in approving the government's plea to reinstate the restrictions. Conservatives Clarence Thomas, Samuel A. Alito Jr., Neil M. Gorsuch and Brett M. Kavanaugh noted they would have denied the government's request. Neither side explained its reasoning. Ghost guns are becoming increasingly popular with teenagers and those whose criminal records keep them from buying guns in the marketplace. Ghost gun sales and their use in violent crimes have spiked sharply in recent years, law enforcement agencies say. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives, ATF, imposed new regulations on the weapons under the Gun Control Act of 1968. Those regulations, Prelogar told the Supreme Court, do not prohibit buying or selling kits to assemble weapons. Instead, they require complying with the same regulations that concern commercial gun sales, such as obtaining licenses, marking products with serial numbers, conducting background checks, and keeping records to allow law enforcement to trace firearms used in crimes. But O'Connor in rulings has said the regulations exceed ATF's authority. The liberty interests of law-abiding citizens wishing to engage in historically lawful conduct, building their own weapons, outweighs the government's competing interest in preventing prohibited persons from unlawfully possessing firearms, he wrote in one The Fifth Circuit considered the merits of O'Connor's ruling at a hearing on September 7, but has not issued a decision. In the meantime, O'Connor granted a new motion against ATF rules at the behest of two companies, Blackhawk Manufacturing and Defense Distributed, and said they could continue sales. His view was that the Supreme Court's order covered only his decision to halt the regulations nationwide, and that he could continue to provide relief to individual companies that showed their livelihoods were threatened. Prelogar said the companies and the lower courts were trying to take advantage of wording in the Supreme Court's August order to undermine its clear implications. But in its filing, Blackhawk's lawyers said the court's August order was focused on the nationwide implications of ATF's regulations. Based upon Blackhawk's reading of the plain language of the stay order, it not only was permitted but was required to return to the district court to seek relief to preserve its ability to stay in business, the filing said. Both the district court and the Court of Appeals agreed. This in no way constituted an affront to basic principles of judicial review. The case is Garland v. Blackhawk. The second trial of a police officer in the death of Elijah McClain begins Friday, one day after a Colorado jury convicted one officer and acquitted another in the 23-year-old unarmed black man's fatal encounter with Aurora police in 2019. McClain's death galvanized protests against police brutality and racial injustice that swept the country in 2020 and spurred state and local policy changes for the kind of chokehold restraints and ketamine injections used during his arrest. The trial of suspended Aurora police officer Nathan Woodyard, 34, begins with jury selection Friday. Woodyard, the officer who placed McClain in the carotid restraint maneuver that slows blood flow to the brain, is the only first responder from the incident to stand trial alone. The jury split its verdict in the case's first trial, convicting suspended Aurora police officer Randy Roedema, 41, of criminally negligent homicide and third-degree assault, but acquitting fired officer Jason Rosenblatt, 34, of the same charges. McClain was walking home from a convenience store near his apartment on the night of August 24, 2019, when he was detained by police responding to a 911 caller who reported the young massage therapist as looking sketchy. McClain was wearing a black ski mask because of a medical condition that made him cold, family said, and he was carrying a shopping bag when police approached. McClain was listening to music through headphones and didn't initially respond when officers called to him. They then tackled McClain before Woodyard placed him in a carotid hold. Responding paramedics injected him with ketamine, a powerful sedative. McClain never regained consciousness after the arrest and was taken off life support several days later. News of McClain's death remained mostly local for 8 months until George Floyd's murder by Minneapolis police in 2020 sparked scrutiny of cases in which unarmed black people were killed, including Breonna Taylor in Louisville and Ahmaud Arbery in suburban Georgia. Colorado Attorney General Phil Weiser, Democrat, in a 32-count indictment charged 5 Aurora first responders, Roedema, Rosenblatt, Woodyard and Aurora Fire Rescue paramedics Jeremy Cooper, 49, and Peter Sachiniak, 51, who jointly face trial in November. All 5 defendants pleaded not guilty. What charges do the defendants face? The 5 defendants face charges of criminally negligent homicide and reckless manslaughter, plus other individual charges. Each of the defendants, except Woodyard, was also charged with second-degree assault, the most serious of the charges. The cases, including the one starting this week, are expected to focus on which actions most directly contributed to McClain's death and on the defendant's state of mind. To meet the standard of recklessness, the prosecution must prove that the defendants knew their actions carried the risk of death when they engaged McClain, said Eric Johnson, a law professor at the University of Illinois College of Law who focuses on criminal law. The criminal negligence standard only requires prosecutors to show that the officer's failure to perceive the risk was a gross deviation from the standard of care, he said. Prosecutors also have the burden of proving that the acts in question, the restraint and the injection of ketamine, were a but-for cause of death, meaning that if the actions had not occurred, McClain would not have died. In this kind of case where you have multiple contributing factors, it can be hard to prove which factor was cause of death. Paramedics will claim it was the chokehold, and the cops will say it was the ketamine, Johnson said. Who is prosecuting the case? The Office of Weiser, the Colorado Attorney General, is handling the prosecution. Then Adams County District Attorney Dave Young declined to file charges in the weeks after McClain's death in 2019. Citing an initial autopsy report, he said he found no proof that the first responders caused McClain's death. After the murder of Floyd in Minneapolis brought renewed attention to McClain's death, Colorado Governor Jared Polis, Democrat, appointed Weiser to probe the case as a special prosecutor. Weiser said in 2021 that his office had the option to review Young's records on the case or convene a statewide grand jury to investigate. "We decided to take the latter course because whenever a person dies after an encounter with law enforcement, the community deserves a thorough investigation," Weiser said at the time. "Mr. McClain's family deserves it. And justice requires it." What are the defendants saying? The 5 defendants have mostly let their legal filings speak for them. In a filing last year, Woodyard asked that the case against him be dismissed, arguing that several medical experts who testified before the grand jury said McClain died of the effects of ketamine administered by paramedics, not Woodyard's carotid hold. A judge later struck that evidence and arguments, according to the Denver Gazette, which obtained the court filings meant to be under seal. Lawyers for Cooper and Sachiniak unsuccessfully filed petitions seeking dismissal. They argue that Weiser didn't have jurisdiction to bring charges after Young, the former Adams County District Attorney, declined to bring charges, citing the first autopsy report. An amended autopsy report was filed after more evidence, including body camera footage of the incident, came to light. The new report states that McClain died of complications of ketamine administration following forceful restraint, a boost for the prosecution's argument. Undermining the prosecutor's case is that the manner of death, for example, accident, homicide, suicide, remains undetermined. What took so long for the case to go to trial? McClain's 2019 death was initially written off by officials as a preventable tragedy, although local residents, including McClain's family, had questioned Aurora officials over the case. It wasn't until mid-2020, when racial justice protests swept the country, that public pressure forced officials to take another look at the death. Investigations of the police and first responder policies eventually led to the decision to put the matter before a grand jury, but jurors were unable to meet for months because of the coronavirus pandemic. In 2021, the grand jury returned the 32-count indictment against the 5 defendants. The amended autopsy report was later filed, citing evidence from the grand jury investigation. For the next year, the defendants argued over who was responsible for McClain's death and sought to separate their cases from one another. In January, a judge finally determined a division of the cases and set trial dates. What was the political fallout in Aurora? A wave of investigations and changes has washed over Aurora in the years since McClain's death and raised questions about the practices of mostly white suburban police departments such as Aurora's and the disproportionately high number of encounters their officers have with residents of color. In June 2020, Polis signed Colorado's police accountability law, which notably banned the use of chokeholds such as the one used on McClain. A month later, Aurora's interim police chief fired 3 officers who mocked McClain's death in a reenactment, including Rosenblatt, who responded in a text message of the photo with "haha." Aurora city leaders hired an independent civil rights lawyer to probe the McClain case and the Aurora Police Department. The Attorney General's office also launched a probe, which led to a 2021 report that found Aurora police have a pattern of racially biased policing and use of excessive force. The probe prompted the city, on behalf of its police department, to enter into a consent decree to reform its patterns and practices. Since McClain's death, Colorado has banned police chokeholds and limited the use of ketamine by paramedics during arrests. In late 2021, the city settled a civil rights lawsuit with McClain's family for $15 million, the largest in Colorado history. 17 FLA officers accused of stealing nearly $500,000 in COVID relief funds. In November 2021, the Broward Sheriff's Office in Florida received a tip from one of its deputies, claiming that their colleagues may have committed fraud to get loans from a federal pandemic relief fund. The tip led officials to a raft of falsified IRS tax forms, business records, and loan applications submitted by Broward deputies, federal officials in South Florida announced Thursday. In total, officers fraudulently obtained nearly $500,000 from the Paycheck Protection Program and Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program intended to provide relief during the global pandemic, investigators said. 17 Broward deputies were charged with wire fraud as a result of the investigation, according to federal and local officials. 8 work in law enforcement for the sheriff's office, and 9 work in the office's Department of Detention, according to a sheriff's office's news release. 2 sergeants were among those charged. The wave of indictments is one of the largest to hit a South Florida agency since the 1980s, the South Florida Sun-Sentinel reported. "We were not going to leave one stone unturned and provide an opportunity for an employee to violate their oath and create embarrassment for this organization," Broward County Sheriff Gregory Toney said. The Broward Sheriff's Office did not respond to a request for comment Thursday night. Court records and news reports do not identify attorneys for many of the accused deputies, and attempts to reach most of them directly were unsuccessful. The Broward Deputy Sheriff's Association, which represents law enforcement deputies in the county, said in a statement that it was aware of the investigation but did not comment directly on the allegations. "Employees and all citizens are entitled to and shall receive due process through the court system," the union said. Brian Silber, an attorney representing 2 indicted deputies, said in an email that there's more to the stories than what is being presented. Jude Faxedomo, an attorney representing a detention deputy charged with 2 counts of wire fraud, asserted that the indictments are misleading. "Many of these deputies have legitimate side businesses for which they applied for the loan," Faxedomo said in a statement. More importantly, many relied on persons misrepresenting themselves as legitimate experts in PPP loans who prepared and submitted the applications on their behalf. Those people should be the government's real target. Some detention deputies last week contacted the Federation of Public and Private Employees, a union that protects detention deputies in Broward County, after they lost their guns, badges, and uniforms amid suspensions, the Sun-Sentinel reported. "The majority of detention deputies are hardworking, good people," Tony Marciano, a business representative for the union, told the newspaper. "People make mistakes. The deputies charged did not commit the alleged fraud in the course of their official duties," U.S. Attorney Mackenzie LaPointe said at a news conference Thursday. But he stressed the severity of defrauding the oft-exploited emergency government relief programs and said federal investigators would continue to pursue those who took advantage of it. "There is a reckoning," LaPointe said. "The cases represent the latest charges brought against people accused of misappropriating COVID relief funds. The government struggled to track the trillions of dollars it distributed during the pandemic in hopes of helping small businesses, unemployed workers, and families in need," a Washington Post investigation found. Fraudsters stole identities to obtain cash, while some politicians used the funds for projects unrelated to the pandemic, the Post has reported. Companies that didn't need extra funding found loopholes to acquire government funds. According to court documents, the Broward officers received fraudulent loans by submitting false information about their payrolls, gross revenue or income of personal companies, and IRS tax returns. Some officers then allegedly sought forgiveness for their loans. LaPointe said when he learned of the level of alleged fraud happening in the same office, "My first reaction was, there must have been some sort of conspiracy." But LaPointe said there was no evidence of a coordinated effort among the charged officers. "The coincidence probably spoke to the vulnerability of large-scale relief programs to be targeted by bad actors," he said. "When you have a federal program that's being offered to provide relief to a large number of people, you are always going to have opportunistic individuals who are going to try to take advantage of it," LaPointe said. Toney, the sheriff, said the charged officers would receive due process before being disciplined but indicated that they would not remain with the sheriff's office. "At the end of the day, they will be gone," Toney said. "If they're being criminally charged, there's no place for this in this organization." Charles Edward Littlejohn leaked thousands of tax returns from wealthy people, leading to exposés in the New York Times and ProPublica. A financial consultant who performed contract work for the IRS pleaded guilty Thursday to leaking reams of confidential tax returns filed by the wealthiest Americans, including those of then-President Donald Trump. Charles Edward Littlejohn, 38, admitted in D.C. federal court that he obtained thousands of individuals' tax returns by accessing an IRS database, and then leaked the materials to the New York Times and ProPublica beginning in 2019. The news organizations published blockbuster reports based on the trove of data, showing how Trump and the wealthiest Americans employed financial strategies to slash their federal tax bills, in some cases down to zero. At a plea hearing Thursday, Littlejohn admitted he leaked Trump's tax returns to The Times, which published articles based on the data in the months before the 2020 election. The returns of other wealthy individuals, including tech billionaires Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, and Elon Musk, became the basis of reports in ProPublica, analyzing how the richest Americans managed to evade the federal government's tax bite. Bezos owns The Washington Post. The unprecedented leak of Americans' confidential financial data renewed a debate in Congress about tax policy amid historic levels of income inequality, and served as an X-ray into Trump's secretive finances after years in which he waged legal battles to protect their confidentiality. U.S. District Judge Aneth C. Reyes rebuked Littlejohn several times from the bench and said whatever ends he had could not justify his means. "I cannot overstate how troubled I am by what occurred," Reyes said. After an attorney for Trump, Alina Habba, delivered a statement in court calling for the maximum prison sentence of 5 years for Littlejohn, the judge said, "I agree completely that people taking the law into their own hands is unacceptable. It doesn't matter who the person is who was the victim of a crime," Reyes said, before mentioning Trump by name and telling Habba that the former president could come deliver his own statement at Littlejohn's sentencing, set for January 29. "Everyone can be well assured that there will be serious consequences for this illegal act," Reyes said. In a news release, the Justice Department said Littlejohn tried to hide his tracks and saved the tax returns to multiple personal storage devices before contacting one of the media outlets. After sending a second batch of tax return information to another news organization, Littlejohn then obstructed the forthcoming investigation into his conduct by deleting and destroying evidence of his disclosures, the Justice Department said. By using his role as a government contractor to gain access to private tax information, steal that information, and disclose it publicly, Charles Littlejohn broke federal law and betrayed the public's trust, Attorney General Merrick Garland said in a statement. Littlejohn's attorney, Lisa Manning, declined to comment after the hearing. Speaking on behalf of Trump, Habba urged the Justice Department to investigate whether Littlejohn acted alone or in concert with others. She called the Trump-related leak an atrocity and an egregious breach by an agent of the IRS, for political gain. Littlejohn worked for a private company performing contract work for the IRS, according to federal prosecutors. Neither the Justice Department nor Littlejohn's defense has identified the company. The Times report, Habba noted, was published in September 2020, months before Trump lost re-election to Joe Biden. Habba said Trump probably lost thousands of votes because of the leak. In its article on Trump, The Times said, all of the information The Times obtained was provided by sources with legal access to it. Charlie Stadlander, a Times spokesman, said in an email Thursday night, "We remain concerned when whistleblowers who provide information in the public interest are prosecuted." The Times' reporting on this topic played an important role in helping the public understand the financial ties and tax strategies of a sitting president, information that has long been seen as central to the knowledge that voters should have about the leader of our government and the candidates for that high office. In a court filing, federal prosecutors from the Justice Department's Public Integrity Section said only a subset of the thousands of leaked tax returns, covering at least 152 victims, had been published by the media as a result of the charged unauthorized disclosure. ProPublica is not disclosing how it obtained the data, which was given to us in raw form, with no conditions or conclusions, the news organization said in one report. In another, the media outlet added, "We do not know the identity of our source. We did not solicit the information they sent us." A spokesperson for ProPublica declined to comment Thursday. Reyes noted that the House Committee on Ways and Means had obtained 5 years of Trump's tax returns, covering 2015 to 2020, after prevailing in a years-long legal battle that began under a different judge in the same D.C. courthouse. "This is how we do things in this country. We have laws," Reyes said. "And a court decides what is permitted and what is not permitted." Illegal disclosures such as Littlejohn's could imperil the government's ability to collect taxes, if individuals can't trust their financials will be kept confidential, the judge said. Under federal law, the Justice Department usually would be required to notify each victim of a crime individually. But prosecutors said in a court filing that the large number of potential crime victims in this case makes it impracticable to notify them on an individualized basis, and the judge granted their request to publish mass notices instead on a Justice Department website. Spencer S. Sue and Devlin Barrett contributed to this report. The redrawn congressional map moved whites in and blacks out. But the legislature said those decisions focused on political party, not race. The Supreme Court on Wednesday seemed likely to reinstate a South Carolina congressional map drawn by the GOP majority legislature that a lower court found exiled 30,000 black voters to create a district safer for a white Republican incumbent. Just a few months ago, the justices found that Alabama had illegally drawn its congressional map to dilute the power of black voters. But on Wednesday, the question was whether South Carolina's new map, which moved black voters from one congressional district to another, was a permissible gerrymander to bolster the Republican majority or an unconstitutional attempt to sort voters by race. Chief Justice John G. Roberts, Jr., who wrote the Alabama decision last term, said disentangling race and politics in gerrymandering cases is very, very difficult when voting is polarized along both racial and political lines. Black voters and organizations challenging the South Carolina maps, he said, had no direct evidence that racial data, rather than political data, dominated. Have we ever had a case before where all it is circumstantial evidence? Roberts asked Leah C. Aden of the Legal Defense Fund, which is representing the challengers. He added, "I'm not saying you can't get there, but it does seem that this would be breaking new ground in our voting rights jurisprudence." The case is one of several across the country in which courts are considering challenges to congressional redistricting plans, enough that their eventual rulings could play a large role in determining which party controls the U.S. House after the 2024 elections. In the Alabama case, Roberts and Justice Brett M. Kavanaugh joined the court's three liberals to form a majority, finding the state's plan violated the Voting Rights Act by not creating a second congressional district, out of 7 in the state, where black voters made up a large enough share of the electorate to have a strong chance of electing their candidate of choice. Tuesday's South Carolina case was in some sense the flip side of that decision, examining whether the maps violated the Constitution's bar on using race as an unjustified and predominant factor in drawing districts. A 3-judge panel in January said the map illegally split black neighborhoods in the Charleston area. Representative Nancy Mace, Republican, South Carolina, who had squeaked by her Democratic opponent in 2020, coasted to victory in 2022 in the redrawn district, keeping her seat in what has become the state's 6-1 Republican-dominated congressional delegation. The strategies ultimately exiled over 30,000 African American citizens from their previous district and created a stark racial gerrymander of Charleston County and the city of Charleston, said the panel of judges, 2 nominated by President Barack Obama and 1 by President Biden. The judges, quoting from testimony at trial, found that the changes were dramatic and created tremendous disparity in the placement of African Americans in 2 congressional districts, Mace's and the district represented by Representative James E. Clyburn, the assistant Democratic House leader. The judges found that South Carolina's mapmaker tried to keep the African American population below a certain target in Mace's district, treating Charleston County in a fundamentally different way than the rest of the state. Washington lawyer John M. Gore, representing South Carolina, said the lower court panel had made numerous missteps and one fundamental one. The legislature achieved its political goals by moving Republicans into the district and Democrats out of the district, Gore said. All of the direct evidence confirms that it used political data, not racial data, to identify Republicans and Democrats. The liberal justices said that just was not so. The lower court held a trial, weighed evidence, and judged the credibility of each side's experts, Justice Elena Kagan said. And the court said no, the evidence showed that you were doing race as a proxy for politics. Justice Sonia Sotomayor agreed, asking detailed questions about whether white Democrats were treated differently from black Democrats. The numbers are incredible, she said. Much of the hearing was focused on those types of specifics. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson said the Supreme Court's role should be only to decide whether the lower court had made a clear legal error in its ruling. But conservative Justice Samuel A. Alito Jr. said that was different from simply deferring to the lower court. Finding clear error is a very demanding standard, but it is not an impossible standard, Alito said. And it doesn't mean that we simply rubber stamp findings by a district court, particularly in a case like this, where we are the only court that is going to be reviewing those findings. Alito and Kavanaugh asked questions about the methodology of the experts and details about moving voters in certain neighborhoods from Mesa's district to Clyburn's, and vice versa. Justice Neil M. Gorsuch questioned Justice Department lawyer Caroline A. Flynn, who supported the black challengers, about a passage in the government's brief that said it would have been plausible for the district court to have come to the exact opposite conclusion it came to here, meaning that race did not predominate. Kavanaugh followed up. You've looked at this record and you obviously concluded that the district court could have said no, that expert evidence is not sufficiently reliable or probative in light of the overall record to support the plaintiff's case, he asked. Well, we think that the expert evidence is a big part of it, Flynn responded. We think that there were credibility findings here that might have come out differently with a different three-judge panel, possibly. It's kind of hard to tell, because we weren't there seeing the witnesses firsthand. The state has asked the justices to decide Alexander versus South Carolina State Conference of the NAACP by the end of the year because of the approaching 2024 primaries. A civil case entering its second week threatens to put on display unprecedented details about how Trump's business operated. When Donald Trump needed to value his Trump Tower apartment for homeowners insurance in 2010, he personally showed an appraiser around the unit for 15 minutes, but ushered him out before the expert could take any measurements. Trump's company then declared that the 11,000 square foot unit measured 30,000 square feet, nearly 3 times its actual size. A few years later, expert appraisers told Trump his 70-story office building at 40 Wall Street in Manhattan, steps from the New York Stock Exchange, was worth $260 million. But Trump soon claimed in financial documents that it was worth nearly $530 million, more than doubling its stated value. In 2018, while Trump was president, his company cited a seasoned New York valuation expert to claim in its financial statements that Nike Town, a luxury retail store adjoining Manhattan's Trump Tower that has since closed, was worth $445 million. The expert later told investigators he provided no such input and that Trump's process to arrive at the figure didn't make any sense. Those details are drawn from thousands of pages of court documents prepared by New York Attorney General Letitia James as evidence in the civil fraud case she has filed against Trump. The documents show how accounting, banking, and real estate experts repeatedly informed Trump how much his properties and businesses were really worth. But over and over again, the documents reveal that Trump, his adult sons, and top executives allegedly ignored or sidelined those experts, exchanging their figures for numbers from another source, Trump's own intuition. Over more than 4 decades as a developer, Trump, now the leading candidate for the 2024 Republican presidential nomination, has routinely exaggerated how much he and his assets are worth, while minimizing or omitting liabilities and debts. These boasts were central to the reputation he cultivated as a real estate mogul. The trial against Trump's business that on Tuesday entered its second week threatens to reveal the internal workings of Trump's business in never-before-seen detail. James, an elected Democrat, and her team arrived at trial, after having reviewed millions of pages of documents about him and his company, armed with a trove of legal ammunition that will be detailed in court in coming weeks. Trump is separately facing 4 upcoming criminal trials, one with federal charges in D.C. and another with state charges in Georgia for allegedly trying to block the 2020 election results, one with federal charges in Florida for allegedly possessing classified documents after leaving office and obstructing government efforts to get them back, and one with state charges in New York for allegedly falsifying business records in connection to a hush money payment in 2016. He has denied all wrongdoing and called the James case a pure witch hunt with the purpose of interfering with the elections of the United States of America. In the ongoing civil case, his lawyers have said the Trump Organization's practices were not illegal. Trump attorney Christopher Kise told the judge last week that there was no nefarious intent in putting company statements together, and subsequently there was no illegality, there was no fraud, there are no victims. James's office has been investigating Trump's business for more than 4.5 years, using a team of lawyers and forensic accountants to acquire documents through subpoenas to his company, banks, insurers, and business partners, many of which would otherwise have remained confidential. By the time the lawsuit was filed, the Attorney General's team had interviewed 65 witnesses, including his adult children and nearly all of his closest business confidants. That includes individuals with knowledge of intimate details of his business who managed to remain out of the limelight during Trump's presidency, but who were compelled to provide lengthy depositions for the first time in the case and are now prepared to testify against him and his company during the coming weeks and months. The case is expected to feature Trump's own testimony. Attorneys on the case will also point to a deposition Trump sat for after initially avoiding questions by invoking his Fifth Amendment right not to answer questions for fear of self-incrimination more than 400 times, using it for every question. Appraisers are right and wrong. Everybody knows that, he said during an April session with James's office, according to a transcript of the deposition filed with the court. He then defended making estimates based on gut instincts. You use common sense. You use some other things. You know, people come up with numbers. Sometimes they're right. Sometimes they're wrong, he said. At issue in the trial that opened last week in New York Supreme Court in Manhattan are allegations that the Trump Organization and some of its executives issued fraudulent annual statements for a decade beginning in 2011 that included real estate values which were sharply different from what Trump reported. The defendants knew that the statements were false, Kevin Wallace, a lawyer in the New York State Attorney General's office, argued in his opening statement on October 2. They then used them to obtain and maintain benefits they were not entitled to. Timothy O'Brien, a journalist who has chronicled Trump and his career for decades, said the Attorney General's case touches on what may be the former president's biggest insecurity and that it appears to be the first time his practices for valuing his business have been examined in a courtroom. His self-worth is completely tied up in money and a pecking order that he associates with wealth, O'Brien said. He spent the better part of his 77 years lobbying the media and banks, and anyone else who wanted to listen, to consider him far, far wealthier than he is because that's what he associates with success. Justice Arthur Engoron has already found that the company broadly committed fraud, ordering the cancellation of Trump business certificates as punishment. An appellate court has temporarily blocked the order from taking effect. Engoron will determine at the end of a trial that could last nearly 3 months whether specific illegal acts were employed to advance the fraud. If he finds in James's favor, he could order the repayment of $250 million in allegedly ill-gotten gains and make it nearly impossible for Trump to do business in the state. The vivid courtroom display threatens to undermine the persona that Trump aggressively crafted throughout his career, one that carried him to stardom on The Apprentice and to the White House in 2016, and may help explain why the case has appeared to particularly enrage the former president. Trump personally attended the first several days of the trial, turning what is otherwise an orderly process into a spectacle by offering tirades to the media each time he stepped in and out of a private room in the courthouse where he and his team were assigned to wait between courtroom sessions. He repeatedly blasted the proceedings on social media. The defense has said Trump's valuations were the result of his keen sense for development potential and the value of his own brand, an argument similar to one he has made for decades when challenged about the size of his business. He has pressed journalists to publish his estimates, at one point pretending to be a fake company spokesman named John Barron to push Forbes to raise its estimate of his net worth as part of the magazine's regular rankings of wealthy individuals. In 2006, he filed a lawsuit against author O'Brien, claiming the journalist defamed him by asserting in a book that Trump was worth only $250 million. In that case, Trump was caught by O'Brien's attorneys falsely representing his wealth 30 times before the judge dismissed the case, according to a deposition. When Trump was first required to file a government disclosure form during his campaign, in 2015, he issued a statement saying his net worth was in excess of $10 billion. His own financial statement, relying on several disproven figures, showed a net worth of $4 billion less. A Forbes journalist asked him that year why he cared so much, why had he gone to such great lengths to inflate his wealth. It was good for financing, Trump said. Therein lies the crux of James's case, that Trump used his inflated financial statements to obtain preferential treatment from banks and insurers, conduct that she argues violates state law due to its capacity or tendency to deceive, or creates an atmosphere conducive to fraud. Trump and his attorneys counter that no lender lost money because of the figures Trump included on his financial statements. In depositions, Deutsche Bank employees testified that the bank recorded millions of dollars in profits as a result of loans to the Trump Organization. The parade of witnesses that will reveal new details about how Trump's company operates began as the trial opened last week. Former Trump Organization controller Jeffrey McConney testified that he and longtime Trump Organization finance executive Alan Weisselberg repeatedly reached steeply inflated values for company assets using illusory methods. One instance involves McConney's testimony Friday about the valuations of a dozen Trump Park Avenue condominiums. The Trump Organization valued the condos at $50 million in 2011 and 2012 and nearly $136 million in 2020, even though company executives knew they were rent-stabilized, meaning they could not be sold as regular condos, according to trial evidence. During the depths of the country's financial crisis in 2010, they had even been appraised for as low as $750,000 in total, and in an appraisal a decade later, for $84.5 million, still far below what the Trump Organization claimed the properties were worth, documents show. Asked on the stand if he and Weisselberg discussed misrepresenting the value of the rent-regulated New York apartments, McConney responded, "I believe so, yes." McConney played a central role in gathering information about the company's assets and compiling them in spreadsheets named Jeff Supporting Data, according to a deposition McConney gave to James's team in early 2020. McConney and Weisselberg, his then boss, are defendants in the case. Both no longer work at the company. Longtime Trump accountant Donald Bender testified that he compiled Trump's annual statements of net worth without verifying the figures. Bender worked for Mazars USA, the accounting firm that handled Trump's business and personal tax returns until 2022, when the firm announced that it could no longer stand behind the statements and cut ties with Trump. Bender testified that he received the numbers from McConney and Weisselberg, who took the witness stand on Tuesday. Bender testified he did not violate generally accepted accounting practices, but often did not ask for appraisal information from the company to back up their figures. The financial statements compiled by Bender all came with a cover letter warning that the values contained in the report were not verified. The defense has pointed to that warning as proof that banks and insurance firms didn't rely on the figures. In his deposition, Trump said the letter included a worthless clause, a line that he said was intended to notify recipients that they needed to do their own analysis. "I have a clause in there that says, 'Don't believe the statement, go out and do your own work,'" he said. Other insider details about the company are likely to emerge in coming weeks, including new information about how Trump misdescribed his own famed Trump Tower apartment. When the Chubb Insurance Agency sent an appraiser to determine the value of Trump's triplex apartment in 2010, he was not allowed to see the primary bedroom because he was told Mrs. Trump was sleeping, according to James's complaint. 7 years later, Forbes, citing real estate records, published a story titled "Donald Trump Has Been Lying About the Size of His Penthouse." Trump subsequently dropped the value of the unit from $327 million in 2016 to $116.8 million in 2017. In his April deposition, Trump was asked directly by an attorney for James how big his apartment was. "I don't know. I would think it would be 12 or 13,000 square feet, Trump said. He said he agreed with the 2017 reduction in value, but ducked questions about why the unit was misvalued in the first place and how the reevaluation came about, details that could come out at trial. Information about how Trump valued other key properties in his real estate empire, his 40 Wall Street office building, his Park Avenue condos and a minority stake he owns in another office tower, are likely to be revealed as well. A transcript of Trump's April deposition shows that he said he valued 40 Wall Street at more than double a bank-commissioned estimate, which James's team found in the company's files, because bank appraisals are always low. He also said he boosted the value because he was considering replacing the offices with a more valuable luxury condominium tower. But he did not deduct the costs that would be involved in that kind of transition, like getting zoning approvals or erecting a colossal residential project. James's court filings showed the company often provided business partners with only hard copies of Trump's financial statements instead of electronic versions. Some insurers weren't given copies of his statements at all and instead were asked to sit in a room and read Trump's copies. The practices, she argued, were intended to make it harder for other companies to question the Trump Organization's figures. When asked about who prepared his financial statements, Trump said in his deposition, "For the most part my people did this. They would give me a statement. I would certainly look at it. But I had not a lot to do with it. But in court filings, James has revealed who her investigators believe has been in charge of preparing the documents since Trump became president, a junior employee, only a few years out of college and with no professional accounting training.